So who am I? I'm a psychiatrist. I'm a medic by background, trained at UCL, then did my psychiatric training at the Maudsley Hospital in South London. And I now hold a clinician scientist award from the National Institute of Health Research. And the National Institute of Health Research is a government-funded body. They gave me a 5-year grant back in 2017 to investigate the safety and feasibility of psilocybin as a treatment in resistant depression. So if you are a UK taxpayer, thank you. I think this is, as far as I know, this is the largest amount of money that the UK government has ever given for clinical research into psychedelics. And I'm sort of honoured and kind of amazed that it happened, really. What's slightly unique about me is not only do I do this, but I also have a foot in the other camp. I also suffer from mental health problems in my life. It runs strongly in my family, and so I have very personal experience of how the NHS works and how psychiatry and psychological therapy work, but also of being mentally ill myself. And I might add that the conventional treatments work well for me, but what I see in my clinical practice is so many people where they don't. And it's for those people that I do this for and that I'm interested in. So I lead a small research group that I set up at King's College London in 2018. It's called the Psychedelic Trials Group, and we focus on clinical trials with psychedelics and related drugs like MDMA. This is the team, small but growing, with Alan Young, who is the chair of mood disorders at King's College London, right at the top. He has been hugely supportive of me in developing this team. And we are composed of people who help with the research, junior psychiatrists, psychologists, psychotherapists, and our wonderful administrator and research nurses who make all of the research happen. I'm so grateful to them. All academics need to declare their conflicts of interest. So we receive grant money from Compass Pathways to do phase 1 and 2 trials of psilocybin. I don't benefit from that per se. King's gets it. We spend it to do the trials that Compass want us to do. I don't have any personal financial interest in the development of psilocybin. And as I say, my salary is paid for at the moment by the UK government. So this is what we're talking about, two drugs that used to be medicines, and in a sense still are. No one's ever said that they're not, except for in 1971, the UK enacted the Misuse of Drugs Act and its associated regulations, and this mimicked the single UN Convention on Drugs that was heavily influenced by the Nixon administration in the US at the time. And they designated LSD and later psilocybin as Schedule 1 drugs. And the problem with Schedule 1 is that it legally denotes the drugs as not for medical use. So what does that mean in practice? It means that I can sign a prescription for heroin without a government license, but I cannot sign a prescription for psilocybin or LSD without a government license. I am one of the few people in the country who has one of those licenses, but they're extremely difficult to get hold of and quite expensive. So that happened around 1917. As Crispin said, we've sort of lived with 50 years of prohibition, and that had an effect on the research, and this is the effect on the research. This is the absolute number of publications about psychedelics, going from 1950, which was the inception of PubMed, to 2020. The blue line is pre-Schedule 1. You see 1,608 publications, and you can then see after Prohibition the steady decline to the sort of dark ages of the 80s, 90s, and early noughties, where there was really very research at all. But now we are seeing a resurgence of interest. There's lots of reasons for that, which I won't go into now. But it is, some people say it's a renaissance. I just say it's a renewal of interest. And there are actually more publications now than there were prior to Prohibition. So signs of hope, I think, and I think that we can only expect this line to continue to go up. So let's turn to what I'm interested with psychedelic drugs is how do you get them? How do you make them into medicines again? How do you do this? And actually, we have a very well-described, well-regulated drug development process. It arose out of the thalidomide tragedy back in the 50s and was a societal and political demand for safe and effective treatment. And the drug development process that we have today reflects that. And essentially, if you want to develop a drug, you have to go through a series of trials. And these trials are to demonstrate that the drug is at least safe and is at least better than the normal passage of time or a placebo. And this process proceeds in a number of phases. Phase 1 trials are first in human trials. Phase 2 trials are first in patient trials. Phase 3 trials, which are the critical ones, are the definitive safety and efficacy trials that lead to an application for medical licensing. And if a Schedule 1 drug receives a medical license, then it must be rescheduled. Well, it doesn't have to be rescheduled, but it should be rescheduled. And that's what we've seen with various forms of cannabis over the years. And this process allows us to, I think, address some of the stigmas that have built up surrounding psychedelic drugs. David Nutt has talked a lot about the Schedule 1 cycle of stigma, which is essentially no one will fund psychedelic drug development because the drugs are legally defined as being bad and not for medical use. I think actually that's starting to change now. And my point really is that clinical trials have the power to challenge the legal status of psychedelics and challenge the stigma around them. The problem is that this process is long and arduous and very tightly regulated and extraordinarily expensive these days. I'll say a little bit about that in a minute. And at the moment, for psilocybin, we are in phase 2. We've done our first in human trials. We are now in our first in patient trials. But the big ones, the phase 3 trials, which cost tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, they are still in the future. And I think it's there where the real challenge lies in getting to medical licensing. And if we get a medical licensing, another even more interesting conundrum arises, and that is how do we incorporate psychedelics into the existing health system? And being a psychiatrist and having worked for many years in the NHS and a little bit privately, as well as having personal experience of mental health problems, I think I'm well placed to give an opinion about that. But it is, as physicists say, a non-trivial problem because I'm not really sure the psychiatric system is yet set up to deliver psychedelics as treatment. This is our dosing room. This is in the basement of King's College Hospital. Looks nice because we make it look nice. Otherwise, it looks a bit like a ward. But the point of showing you this is how we do these trials in a medical context. We do try to make people feel as safe and supported as possible, whilst not having too much medical paraphernalia around, which gives the wrong feeling to things. This is one of our phase 1 trials that we did with Compass last year. And in this, we demonstrate the feasibility of giving psilocybin to up to 6 people simultaneously. That should be published later this year. These are our 2 therapists at King's, Liam and Gemma, and our single person occupancy room that we do the depression trials in, where we dose 1 person at a time. So, just aware of time, I'm going to quickly rattle through what we're doing at King's, what's happening at Imperial, 2 main centres in the UK, a little bit about what's happening around the world, and then just say a little bit about some of the barriers and difficulties that I see moving forward. So you can see we've got 7 trials on the boil at the moment. First there, the Cider Trial is a treatment-resistant depression trial funded by NIHR. That's my trial. Then we have a number of trials funded by Compass, their own phase 2B multi-site trial that's happening across Europe and the US. That will be a very pivotal study when it comes out, hopefully next year. A healthy volunteers trial that we completed with Compass last year, and then a number of other smaller scale trials that are in setup surrounding post-traumatic stress disorder, various anxiety disorders, autism, and finally at the bottom, slightly separate to what we're talking about, but using MDMA for the treatment of PTSD, and that is a trial that is sponsored by the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies from the US, and in the UK is being funded by Supporting Wounded Veterans, who are a wonderful charity founded by Gilly Norton. So the problem with all of these is A, they are very expensive, and B, the expense is made much worse by Schedule 1. And the reason is that Schedule 1 creates all sorts, well, it states all sorts of safe custody and security regulations that you have to comply with, and that shifts the costs a lot higher. If the drugs were in Schedule 2, then we would be exempt from meeting those regulatory requirements, but there would still be sufficient safe custody regulations to ensure that the drugs are used properly and not diverted. Schedule 2 is the same schedule that medical heroin is in, for example, a much more dangerous drug. So we will call shortly for psilocybin to be rescheduled from Schedule 1. And this should enable the research to proceed more at pace, and therefore more likely that we can deliver this trial to patients more quickly. The Centre for Psychedelic Research at Imperial College London, led by Robin Carhart-Harris, they did the first pilot trial that I was also involved with, called SILADEP-1, in treatment-resistant depression. That is now finished. It was published back in 2016. It is upon that trial that a lot of the excitement and hope and expectation surrounding psychedelics and depression is based. They also have another head-to-head trial of escitalopram versus psilocybin. Escitalopram is a standard SSRI drug that is prescribed for depression. They've just completed that trial. They're crunching the data at the moment. And Robin tells me they have an anorexia nervosa trial in the pipeline. And David tells me there is a pain trial using psilocybin in the pipeline too. So that's the landscape in the UK. As I say, it feels as though there are quite a lot of trials happening, but actually these trials are incredibly difficult to do, and Schedule 1 really does not help at all, and that's part of the reason for our group here. You can see some mostly trials in the US, but also Switzerland taking place in obsessive compulsive disorder, again anorexia, major depressive disorder, and various forms of dependence on drugs and alcohol. And remember that the best pre-prohibition evidence for the use of psychedelics was actually in alcoholism, that using LSD. So this is where we are, phase 2 for psilocybin. We need to get to medical licensing, but to do that we have to go via phase 3, and it is expensive. But this is a paper from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, an independent body that essentially estimated how much it costs to bring a drug to market. And you can see there that the median was $985.3 million. And most of that cost is accounted for by phase 3 trials. So we've still got some way to go with psilocybin, but with companies like Compass now investing heavily in this, I think we may get there, and that is a cause for great hope. There's some pitfalls of psychedelic drug development. I'm going to whiz through these because I'm aware I'm a bit over time. It's quite difficult to fit psychedelics into the modern paradigms of trial design, partly because they have a characteristic subjective effect, so people can guess when they're on them. There are various ways around that to retain objectivity. But there's also a form of selection bias that tends to occur in particularly early studies. People with positive expectations are more likely to volunteer for early trials with drugs like psychedelics. Again, over time, that will be mitigated by replication from different groups. But psychedelics, as I say, don't really fit very well into modern paradigms of trial design. The reason for that is because psychedelics are very context dependent, but randomized controls trials are designed to separate drugs from context. So for that reason, I think we need to retain a degree of equipoise and agnosticism over how these trials will turn out. Let's wait and see. There's an element of unpredictability with psychedelics, as we all know, but this is why we give them in a safe and supportive setting with medical backup. We don't often have to do it, but if so, we can turn off the psychedelic effect if someone is really, really struggling. As I say, more of the problem that we come up against is one problems pertaining to law, society, and culture, particularly Schedule 1, a broader stigma surrounding the drugs that Schedule 1 has resulted in. And the other problem I think comes from the psychedelic community itself, and that's what Hattie Wells has called psychedelic exceptionalism. And that's this idea that psychedelics are somehow special and that they deserve sort of special status. I think that that's a problem because we need to remember the stigma that is out there, and the ways that we need to engage with that is probably to treat psychedelics like any other drugs, while still retaining due respect and due heed to their history and their power, and the need for safe and supportive setting. So, to sum up, how do we develop psychedelics in the way that governance and wider society can engage with? Well, the first for me is to engage with standard drug regulatory processes. They are there for a reason, to develop safe and effective drugs. That's why clinical trials exist, and that's what we're doing. So I think that's a good thing. I think to engage with the public, we need to focus on areas where there is unmet health need. So we do actually have a lot of treatments for things like depression, but as I say, there are a lot of people for whom those treatments do not work, and I think it is. I think most people will accept an argument where you are developing a treatment where there is a gap in currently available treatments, and that's why we're focusing on treatment-resistant depression with psilocybin. I do think we need to pay heed to the history, the culture, and the setting of psychedelics, and this essentially boils down to respect for their power to inculcate change. I think we are doing that, but I think finally we need to be realistic about what we can achieve. This is potentially an addition to our established treatments, but it is not a replacement for anything. So I will stop there, and thank you very much for your attention. My email address there is you want to write to me direct.